I'm investigative journalist Molly Barrows. For years, I've covered the stories that made headlines in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf Coast. Murders, missing persons, and mysteries of all kinds. These cases are far from over for many victims because the full story has yet to surface. Join me for Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier side of the South and expose the lies, greed, and corruption that often weighs down the truth. It's time to turn the tide and get a shot at justice. Hi, I'm investigative journalist Molly Barrows, a longtime reporter in Northwest Florida. We like to cover some of the saltier stories that surface along the Gulf of Mexico here on Gulf Coast Confidential. And this is my co-host, Pam Hill. Of course, she also is wonderful to have on this show. She has a unique perspective on a lot of the cases that we talk about here on Gulf Coast Confidential Conversations. Her sister, Sharon Adelot, was murdered by her own son in 2013. And prior to that, Sharon Adelot had undergone some trauma in her own personal life. Her then husband had been fired from his job as a teacher at a Pensacola high school. In fact, Pensacola High School was where he worked, and he was fired for having an inappropriate relationship with a 13-year-old girl. So if you're interested in any of those cases to learn more about Pam's background and her experience, check out Confessions in the Field House, as well as Murder and Madness. And those are cases that we continue to follow because her nephew, Brandon Adelot, was found not guilty by reason of insanity. So we like to talk about a lot of crimes that not just touch on the themes and the details of the crimes that themselves, but also just what we can learn from them because of what Pam's been through and my experience as a longtime reporter and just what I've seen. And I think our overall goal is to let people know, the more we talk about this, perhaps it can help you prevent tragedy in your own life.
I hope so. And I never, ever thought that I'd even be talking about these kind of things. I was brought up where we didn't talk about things like this, like pedophilia, murder, rape, whatever. But here we are. We talk about it. We've got a podcast about it.
I know. And there is sadly so much to talk about.
Unfortunately.
And this is the third case in a series that we're calling Lambs to the Slaughter because we're focusing on authority figures who prey on vulnerable children. In the first case, we talked about Ryan Walsh, a youth director at Gulf Breeze United Methodist Church, who was convicted of basically sending sexual texts and fondling a 13-year-old girl. In the second one, in Lambs to the Slaughter, we talk about Mark Luau, a Pensacola area teacher who victimized numerous girls, targeted them from the time that they were in middle school. And again, same scenario as the Ryan Walsh. He targeted children that had also been who were emotionally vulnerable, and some of them had perhaps even experienced some sort of neglect and abuse themselves. Mm-hmm. And in this case, this is another horrendous case. I mean, just when you think you can't hear about anything that will shock you, this is just awful. And this third and final one in Lambs to the Slaughter, we're talking about a case out of Tennessee that recently made headlines. And of course, here on Gulf Coast Confidential, we focus on crimes that happen along the Gulf Coast, but we also think it's important to talk about similar crimes that happen in other communities because even if it doesn't happen on the Gulf Coast, we live in the Gulf Coast and we can learn from the way all killers and predators operate because so often they use the same MOs to go after their victims. So with that said, let's dive into Camilo Campos. This is a 63-year-old described as a popular soccer coach from Franklin, Tennessee. That's about 20 miles outside of Nashville. He was arrested in July of this year, 2023, after he left his cell phone behind at a restaurant. Well, workers picked it up. They went looking through it to see if they could find who it belonged to, and they discovered appalling videos, y'all, of young boys who were drugged and sexually assaulted. Not only did this man, and again, he's just accused of these crimes at this point, but if these accusations are true, not only did he basically lure these victims into a vulnerable position, but he had all the evidence police needed right there on his phone because, again, it feeds that fantasy. He's got it right there at his fingertips to remember what he had done, but it provided this just lucrative treasure trove of evidence for police. So Turns out a customer had in fact retrieved the device, handed it over to the staff, according to Franklin police. And when the employees attempted to look through the phone to find the owner, that's when they found these horrendous videos, Pam, of unconscious young boys being abused. And the cops said, quote, during an immediate and tireless investigation, detectives found, get this, hundreds of disturbing videos and pictures on the phone. That's from Franklin police in a statement. And they said, they went on to say that, quote, in many of them, Campos recorded himself raping unconscious boys between approximately 9 and 17 years old. I mean, he recorded himself, Pam.
Unbelievable. But yet again, thinks he's untouchable. It amazes me that you don't have a password on your phone anyway, just for anybody. I mean, that just makes good sense. But he doesn't care. He's got that narcissistic tendencies again. And a lot of times in sports, we've done a lot of this to some people's personality. He's probably a good coach. I don't even know as far as like soccer goes, but he's not a good person as far as just living life goes. I'll tell you that. I mean, he's just going to have this on his phone and just enjoy those videos later. He drugged these little boys, drugged with Xanax, which will make them not remember, and other drugs as well. And then not fondles them, this, and all that's horrible anyway. He, do you hear this word? Rapes these little unconscious boys.
And the physical damage that I imagine that he did to them.
Oh my God. I mean, seriously, can you imagine being a pizza parlor employee and you just trying to get this phone back? Some people leave phones in the pharmacy all the time. We go through and do that. We don't look through anything else if we can get through and find who it is or do that emergency ring or whatever. But can you imagine you're a regular little person working at your job, and you see this? At least, praise God, they knew to call the police. They didn't huddle up like these other two cases. They didn't say, oh, let's see what the church can do. Oh, let's see what the school can do. They said, here you go, police. This ain't right.
I know. That does say a lot for them, that they not only were they horrified, but they called the authorities to get them involved.
First.
And the fact that he left his phone, you would think that, my God, if you had that sort of evidence on your phone of this horrendous hobby that you have.
Yeah, he doesn't care.
Pastime.
Yeah, he doesn't care.
I know, but he was clearly not worried about getting caught.
No.
And thankfully he did forget. Thankfully, that customer found it, and thankfully it fell into the hands of staff who cared enough to report it to authorities. Apparently, he lived in the area for about 20 years, and police said he lured children. Gosh, this is just so classic, by visiting local playgrounds and recruiting them as players for his team. So God loved these kids. He basically appealed to their desire to belong, to be part of a fun team, and to feel special. And that's exactly what we saw in the other two cases as well. But these predators, they go after these children that are isolated. And I'm not saying that's the case in these particular situations, because I don't know. But in the other two cases, they were vulnerable students. But children are vulnerable just by the sheer fact that they're trusting and anyone in an authority position. And as a soccer coach, that's another authority position. That's somebody who you would have a tendency to look up to. Like I said, he was described as popular. People liked him. And I mean, you don't want to be a jerk if you're planning to do something horrible with somebody's children. You want to earn the parents' trust as well as the children. And that's what police say he did. Once he earned the trust of the children, he brought them back to his home where he drugged and raped them. Police found video evidence on his phone of the sexual abuse of at least 10 children. 2 of the victims, police said, have been identified so far. They're working to track down the rest. They're unconscious in the videos, and they may not even realize that they had been victimized. So a lot of this is still unfolding, and that's partially why we wanted to talk about it. Again, not a Gulf Coast case, but you just never know. It's a small world that we live in, and it's important to put these guys on blast.
Right.
Not only to give other victims the opportunity to come forward, but there are other victims who weren't necessarily victimized by Campos, but perhaps they were victimized by other child predators. And I think there is power in knowing you're not alone.
Right. And just knowing that this can happen. There are some people that live such a charmed life where nothing in the world's happened too much to them, that when you tell them stuff like, and I was one of those, that's why I can say that. Back in the day when I was younger, this would have blown my wig off.
Right.
I mean, I would have said, what are you talking about? Don't talk about stuff like that. That's not nice. Let's don't talk about that. But we have to. He even took them back to his house and raped them. And remember, these are not, I get upset when in these cases when people say the young men or the young ladies, the under 18 years old, you are not raping a young man. You are not raping a young woman. You are raping a child.
I know.
Let's quit saying it wrong. I correct people every time they say it. They say, well, the young woman, she's 15. That is a child. They're not having sex with the young woman. They are raping a child, which is what he did.
Yeah, that's what he's being held on. Charges of rape of a child and sexual exploitation of a minor. More charges are expected to be filed as the investigation continues. But, Pam, there are so many similarities between this case. And in case you're listening, you might hear the thunder.
Mm-hmm.
That is God poo-pooing pedophiles.
He doesn't like that.
Some may also say it's a thunderstorm in the area.
All right.
But just want to let you know in case you hear that. But, talking about these three cases, it's why we called this episode Lambs to the Slaughter, because these children are vulnerable. And a lot of times their parents are vulnerable too.
Right.
And I'm not as familiar with this case, but in my years of working as an investigative journalist and talking to numerous investigators, especially those who investigate sex crimes and child sex crimes, these guys fit into a pattern. And I thought it was very interesting that they said that he lured them from playgrounds. I know of one case in particular, this little girl, 13 years old. She's never been found, disappeared a couple of decades ago. In fact, her mom and I became close. And it's a story I'm going to do eventually. Her name was Susan Bell, and Susan ended up committing suicide because she never could get over just the loss of her daughter and not knowing. And It's just heartbreaking, and that's a story for another time. But she was in a relationship with a man who was 26 years old when she was 13 because, guess what? He found her at the playground. He and his friends were older, and they hung out at the playground to target these little girls. And every little girl wants to feel like a big girl, and this was pre-internet for the most part. This was but plenty of MTVs on, you name it. And so they're trying to emulate what they think is being a young woman, what they think is being an adult. And these guys catered to that, invited him to a party. She starts dating this older man. He regularly gives her alcohol. And it's just a very tragic situation. She eventually gets pregnant. She tells her mom. Her mom and her brothers go and confront this guy, tell him to stay away from their daughter. He lures her out of the house one final time, and that's the last time anyone ever saw her. And her name was Danielle Bell. And to this day, I do hope that they find her one day. But it just struck me that he lured and trolled her at a playground, he and his friends.
Right.
And it's a common thing. I mean, there was a whole nother case that I'm also going to do a story on. A young man named Warren Williams. He was just a child. He shot and killed his own father. And years later, one of the investigators who had worked that case originally told me that he came across evidence where perhaps Warren had also been targeted by a sexual predator because they had found where this guy the sexual predator that perhaps had been involved in the Warren Williams case, had targeted other kids by also luring the playground. Well, here's the problem, and this is going to go to some of aside from the fact that there's predators out there trolling playgrounds, the playground is this. Hold that phone up.
All right.
That's the playground. The
is
World
where they
Wide Web, the internet. That's where they're trolling for them now. You go to any playground now, you're going to see some kids, but most of the time their parents are there. You're hardly ever going to see young adults. You're hardly ever going to see teenagers. You're hardly ever going to see prepubescent kids because they're all online. They're playing video games, or that's their world. They're texting with each other. They're doing social media. And the predators know that too. And they're using the same tactics that they would in person. They are trolling the digital playground, and they're telling these kids what they want to hear. They're feeding their need to be loved. They're feeding their need for attention. They're feeding their need to just belong, because sometimes maybe they are coming from homes where parents are busy or they're working or whatever the case may be. And that's what I would be interested to know about this soccer coach. The parents, like if he's going to playground and finding these kids, were they by themselves? Were they with parents? Mm-hmm. Were they with parents who were single parents? Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times these predators will target single moms or single parents who need the help, whether it's money or support or just somebody to watch their kid. I've seen that time and time again. I covered the King brothers case.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
And that was another situation where the father left his boys in the care of a guy who had a past record of lewd and lascivious with children because he was struggling for money and he needed help with childcare. And it's such a common issue. And to your point, so many people just don't think because they don't think that way. They don't look at children as a way to achieve sexual gratification, as a way to feed their perverse desires.
And thank God, because you don't know to think that. I didn't know to think a lot of this stuff now. I can't even believe that I know the stuff. Can't even believe we're talking about it. But the other choice is to not talk about it, and I just cannot do that. It's just somebody, you go to playgrounds because that's where 13-year-olds are. Playgrounds. You go online on Snapchat because that's where 13-year-olds are. And then the thing is I don't know if I have become like uber detective or whatever, but I don't let people just walk up to children in my family and start talking to them. I'll be right there. And some of this mentality that we have about that we think our children, when they play a sport, like say football, we think they gonna play on Sunday night, like they're gonna be an NFL player. No, most of them aren't. The thing is, but we fantasize and give some of that weirdo stuff back. And then here's a soccer coach saying, your kid's great, they can play travel ball. Wait, come on. I mean, you're not going to take my kid off. They're not going to go on a bus with you, this, that, and the other. I'm going to be that hard ass.
Yes. Well, and I think that's what we need. We kind of need more hard ass parents. It is so
that's gonna
easy.
Be me.
Yes. And I'm a parent. My daughter's 11. And, in covering a lot of these cases, I mentioned in Lambs to the Slaughter in the second one, or perhaps it was the first one, but I talked about a local case that I've covered recently of a young man that came forward and said he'd been molested by a priest. And in talking to investigators, SVU investigators, about the MO of child predators, they were saying it's very, very rare that they have just one, especially when they're experienced groomers, which is essentially what this kid described, was an experienced groomer.
Right.
And he said it's very rare that they get to that, that they have just one victim. But I asked them, I said, well, and they said that that's not even, in this particular case, that boy was molested at school, but most of the time, that's the real problem, is they're meeting them online.
Secret.
The secret part, right.
Secret, and they can control it and say they didn't do it or whatever. But what happens also with these children, and they're children, I'm going to keep saying that, they're children. What happens is the molester, the predator, the rapist, whatever, assaulter, whatever anybody wants to call them, they mess up the child's life forever. The child that my ex-brother-in-law went after and was sexting with and stuff, she's been in and out of jail 9 times. And he messed her mind up where I don't know that she'll ever have a good life.
I know, and that's what you hear so much. In fact, the young man that I interviewed about the priest molestation case, his mother didn't find out about it. I also interviewed her, didn't find out about it until the late last year. But what they did see was their son angry, and they saw him struggling. And so this abuse happened from the time he was 6th grade to 7th grade, so about a year and a half. And he didn't tell anyone because he said that this priest basically said that there would be consequences for his mother without saying too much that would identify them, but basically said there would be consequences. So he kept it inside. And that's what so many of these abusers do. They threaten these kids either overtly or subtly, and they feel responsible. They feel like somehow it's their fault, or just like with Mark Luau in the second case that we covered, this relieves my stress. You need to do this because this helps me.
Oh, by all means. I mean, seriously, he wouldn't say that to a grown-up.
No, and even Ryan Walsh telling the 13-year-old girl, I'm attracted to young children, to young girls because it makes me feel more like a man. I mean, a grown woman would be like, well, why do I care?
Yeah, or what is your problem?
What are you doing to make me feel more like a woman? Apparently that was his problem. He couldn't step up and be a man. And I do feel, I don't even pretend to get into the mind of these people that want to seduce and go after and abuse kids. But to your point about the long-lasting damage, that's, I think, why I got into covering these cases. I was covering the courts and crime beat as a young woman in my 20s for our local ABC affiliate, and ended up doing so many of these abuse cases because my heart ached for the damage that it does to them long term. And I felt like there was just this outcry of, these people need to be held accountable because they're not going to stop. And I feel like this is another reason why we need to talk about it. The more awareness that's raised, the more perhaps people will recognize we need stiff penalties for these people. Right. They don't need to be out. Right. There is no cure for people who want to have sex with children.
Right. And I call it rape. There's not sex with children. I call it rape. That's just me personally, because a child cannot consent and a child is under 18. And I don't care what they said. It is rape. And there has to be more penalties for that. And people have to say something about, I'm not depending on children to have the answers. I'm depending on other adults. I'm depending on judges. I'm depending on attorneys. I'm depending on psychologists, teachers, pastors and regular people like you and I.
Right. And speaking of regular people like you and I, that's what the investigators told me when I shared with them, okay, well, if the internet's the danger, how do I protect my kid? And they were like, keep her off the internet, period.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, well, she does watch TikTok on my phone sometimes, but I can see where she goes. She goes through my account. They were like, off the internet.
All right. Well, let's do what they say. Let's listen to the experts, and then if we can keep even our faces out of these phones, we could enjoy each other's company and we could see what's going on.
Right. And then the flip side, like we've talked about too, is that they are able to gather evidence. It does leave a digital evidence trail, but it is as easy for them. I mean, that's what's so horrifying when you read about these police raids where they pose as children, just how easy it is for them to find these people that will they're not interested in adults. They are interested in, kids of all ages.
Unbelievable. And it is so interesting to me how a big old 250-pound man can be the expert, I guess. And there's one that was here in Pensacola for a long time that he would pose as a teenager. And he caught a lot of bad, nasty men. And he knew exactly what to say. He knew what he knew what little girls liked and stuff because, like, it's just a formula. He said it wasn't that hard. They walked into the trap just like Winnie the Pooh comes for honey.
Right. And I think that, as we list some of these takeaways, one, it's as parents, we need to be monitoring our children online. If we are going to allow them go online, there has to be steps that you can take to know who they're talking to limit who they're talking to, and to limit their time online if you can't keep up with it. And I need to take my own advice about that. I mean, it is easy as a parent to let them stay online and entertain themselves. We're all busy. And again, if you're not thinking along the lines of what's out there, you don't realize just that you're feeding your children to wolves in sheep's clothing. Right, and that's why another reason I said lambs to the slaughter. You don't expect it from your youth minister. No. You don't expect it from the teacher. You don't expect it from the soccer coach. How about you don't expect it from the federal prosecutor? We talked about,
we did.
Roy Atchison. And the I've done it plenty. If you haven't caught that episode of Gulf Coast Confidential, check that out. That's a former federal prosecutor. Well, he was a federal prosecutor at the time. He's former now because he committed suicide. But he had been busted by police in Detroit in a sting where they were basically putting lures out there for men who wanted to have sex with kids. And he was talking to a police officer who he thought was the mother of a 5-year-old girl. And he showed up at the airport with a Dora the Explorer doll, toys, Cialis, lubricant, some other identified pills. And at first he denied it. But then he started telling the investigators that he had been exploring some of those darker places online where they do talk about having sex with kids. And when he thought that he was talking to a mother and not a police officer about having sex with this child, she had said to him, basically expressing concerns about if he was going to be rough with her, which makes me want to throw up in my mouth a little bit.
For real.
And he'd said, oh, no, I'll be gentle. Tell her she's got a sweet boyfriend, essentially, is what he said, come in. And I've done it plenty, and there'll be no rough stuff. And again, it's just so disgusting. But he had said to police that he had just started dabbling in that, and he had not been successful. He actually had not had any kind of sexual relations with any child. But at that point, I don't know if I believe it.
Yeah.
But the fact that he even wanted to is enough.
Yeah.
That's disturbing. Would he have stopped if he had not been caught? I don't know.
Right. And like I said before with one of the other cases, the problems between their ears.
Yeah,
it's
the
their
fantasies.
Brain.
Yeah. That's what
their brain.
They're wired
Right.
funny.
They may not be doing the sexual stuff, but they may hurt them. They've already hurt them psychologically if they were talking to a real child or a real child's mother. Like I said, those policemen, it is so remarkable to me that policeman could sit there and pretend like he's the mother. This is some real stuff out here.
I know.
This isn't just Olivia Benson and Elliot. This is us. This is in Pensacola, Florida. This is in Franklin, Tennessee. And this is everywhere. There are children everywhere playing soccer. There are pizza parlors everywhere. There are soccer coaches. There are teachers. And there are youth pastors everywhere.
And just like we talked about in the Ryan Walsh case, there is a civil lawsuit. And the attorney that filed that suit basically said religious institutions, and this also applies to any institution where children are prevalent or a big part of the organization, whether it's a school or a religious organization, but that they are natural attractions for pedophiles, molesters, and child predators because they do want to be around where the kids are. So I think that there just needs to be a greater awareness. You can never look too closely. You can never be too trusting, too careful, I should say, with who you entrust to your children. And I don't want to undermine and take away people's joy and have them looking suspiciously at every person in their life. But, going back to our takeaways, 1, monitor their electronic communications. 2, trust your instinct, and just because somebody's likable, if they're alone with your child, that's what pedophiles do.
Yeah, that's what they want.
They're not going to be coming up looking smelly and nasty with like a molester coat on or a badge. It's going to be, not to say that doesn't exist, but these are people that do know to hide. They do know to be friendly. They do know to hide out in the open. Woo!
Yeah, that's some angry stuff right there.
I know that thunderstorm's rough.
Simple stuff too. That like, I don't have any children. I'm an aunt, but I've learned from my nieces and nephews and other things, I will never let them go to the bathroom by themselves when they were underage. And you think about, well, that's a nephew. They can go, no, I will take him in the bathroom with me, or we'll wait on the family bathroom.
It's interesting you should say that. When I was talking to the SBU investigators recently about that, following up on that young man who had said he'd been molested by the priest. And again, I was asking them for advice on how I could help protect my child, and in telling them about different experiences that we'd had recently. I walked her to the bathroom at the beach, and I noticed that there were some young men that were eyeing her, 11 years old, and maybe it's hormones and chicken, but she looks 12 and 13, 14, but they didn't seem to be bothered by that. They weren't looking at her grown mother, you know what I mean? Which I don't care, but I'm just saying I was happy that I walked her to the bathroom is my point. And that's what I was sharing with the investigators. And he goes, you walked her to the bathroom? And I was like, I did. And he goes, a lot of people don't. He goes, you would be surprised how important little things like that can be, because there's been plenty of times when I haven't walked her to the bathroom, like say maybe at a restaurant or if we're at the movie theater or something like that. I might say, okay, well, you know what it is? I'm right around the corner, but maybe it is that lackadaisical thinking. It just that one time, but it is like, to your point, one time you said, just think about your child as a diamond bracelet. You wouldn't leave a diamond bracelet out in the driveway or let the diamond bracelet go to the park alone or let the diamond bracelet be unattended because somebody might snatch it up.
Right. And I go in the bathroom. Go in the bathroom, go in the stall. Maybe I'm paranoid, but I will do that every time. Even the family bathroom, because someone can be where you can't see. Yeah. This happened one time at the mall. A man offered to take my nephew to the bathroom. I'm like, no, thank you. I can take him in the women's bathroom. Why would I do that? But there are plenty of people, oh yeah, this is awkward. I don't care how awkward it is. If you see me out somewhere doing awkward things, that's just what I do.
I know. Well, and so the third takeaway, I would say, 1, monitor the electronic communications. 2, you can never be too careful with who you entrust your children to. Make sure you know all about them. Be careful about who you leave people alone with. And the third thing is, you see the children that these men are targeting, and the very parents that probably need to be listening to this are probably not, whether it's us or other people that are providing information about how you can protect your children. But that's not passing any judgment. People are in vulnerable situations. Maybe it's a single parent who's struggling to work and doesn't have time to spend with their child. Or maybe, they're struggling with their own issues of abuse from when they were children. So they don't recognize the signs. They don't recognize that they're being targeted by another predator because that's what they're used to. That's what they grew up with in their own lives. But it just hurts my heart. And any adult who suffered abuse and any child or young person who is suffering this, to know that they're not alone and that shame is shakeable. You don't have to take that on. You don't have to wear that cloak and carry that abuse forever. And that's what breaks my heart, is that they're taking these kids and they're using their love and their desire for love against them. And it just hurts my heart so much. And I would don't be afraid to push back. I would rather have someone think that I was being a jerk than to be so agreeable that you end up putting yourself in the hands of someone that's going to prey on you.
Right. Like any
but
one
kids
of these
aren't
three.
Right. But that's one thing to say as a grown woman. But when I think of these children that are being targeted, but even in the Luau case, you did have one that pushed back and he raped her anyway.
Oh,
she
yeah.
said,
Well, that's what I'm saying. And we have to make it where children can talk to us and not be judgmental on this especially, but even other things like if they've been out drinking or if they made a bad mistake. I never said, I'm scared to tell my mother, especially if something was going wrong. I'm like, I got to tell my mother because she's the one that helps me.
Right.
But not everybody has that. I know that. But some of these children, I see children all the time through the work I do that I don't know who they talk to sometimes. I really don't. So I don't try to be overly attentive to them, but I try to be kind to them and let them know that, that they matter, type of thing. Send them a birthday card after I ask their parents if it's okay. I won't just do that on my own. Or even giving children candy at the pharmacy or something. We ask their parent because we're strangers. I mean, until later, but kids, candy makes them happy. Well, I don't want somebody getting hurt over a piece of candy.
I know. It is tragic, but
Yeah.
it is interesting. When I remember growing up in Jacksonville, Florida, in the Ponte Vedra Palm Valley area, they had just opened up a new grocery store. And my mom and I went one afternoon after school. You know how you go down the aisles, and then she had forgotten something, and she was like, hey, can you go back and get such and such? And she goes, it's a few aisles back. So you know how there's signs above the grocery store aisles? Well, I'm walking along one end so I can see what each sign is till I find the aisle that I need to. And as I'm walking along, I look at the far end of the aisles, and I notice that a man is keeping up with me.
Oh my.
And it's not very crowded. It's early in the afternoon, and it's not a lot of people. Mothers and daughters and mothers and kids and the occasional person. So he caught my attention because at first I thought, is he looking at me?
Mm-hmm.
And I tell this story because I was in the 4th grade at the time, and I'm trying to put myself in the position of some of these kids. If somebody pays attention to me or this is a little bit of a different scenario. This isn't somebody that I had a relationship with. This isn't a teacher. This isn't somebody that was in a position of authority or trust. This was just a random encounter at a grocery store. But I thought my reaction at the time was interesting as far as getting to know myself.
Yeah.
But I see this adult man walking, and I begin to realize that he is watching me. And I knew enough at that point because my mother had always told me, because of her own personal experiences, you don't ever have to respect any adult that doesn't respect you, because people will use that against you and put you in a bad spot. And I don't ever want you to be the victim of somebody with bad intentions, and whether it's sex abuse or, criminal behavior of some sort of thing. And she didn't get too deep, and certainly not the kind of details that we now know. I was so young. But I immediately thought, well, is this guy a bad guy? Is this stranger danger, if you will? But instead of going back to my mom, I decided to see if I thought, well, maybe I'm wrong. And I stopped at just a random aisle to look at something. And it wasn't what I needed to get. I just wanted to see. Sure enough, this guy comes walking down the aisle. There was nobody else on this aisle but me. And he stood behind me, and he stood so close I could feel his breath on the top of my head. And my parents had just given me several gold charms for my birthday and a little round necklace thing that would hold all the charms. I thought that's what he wanted. It never crossed my mind I was what he wanted. I just thought, I have this beautiful, pretty gold necklace. This is what he wants. So I grab these charms and I turn around and I just look at him with a mean look in my mind.
Yeah.
Like, you can't take my gold charms.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember this look of fear that came over his face. And he stopped and he looked at me and he took a step back, and then he just walked really quickly all the way out the grocery store door.
Oh my goodness.
And the whole thing rocked my world a little bit, because I thought, okay, this is a really strange and unusual situation. And I went back to my mom. I told her what happened. She's like, oh my God. She goes, we'll never do that again. She goes, if you see somebody following you, come back and see me, or go find a manager of the store and point it out. She goes, and we went and told the manager, and we described the guy so that if they ever saw him in there again, that they would know. But it did make me realize, and like I said, I was the kind of kid that was just curious. Maybe it was the investigative reporter in me early on.
Maybe
I
so.
want to know what's going on. But I didn't feel fear. It was more curiosity, and I thought I could handle it.
Mm-hmm.
But I imagine there's a lot of these little kids too, that even when they get in over their heads, if they were emotionally seduced, if you will, because of the faux love and faux attention that they've been given by some of these people, they think they can handle it, and they just get in over their heads, and they don't know how to push back against this manipulation and against these predators, and they know who to find. They know how to find these kids that aren't equipped, that are insecure. and don't know how to push back. So I would just encourage parents also empower your children with the ability to say no and to push back.
Right. And to come right back to where you are.
Right. And don't try to do it
No.
yourself.
See, I would have been that kid. I would have been back. My mother. I'll go to my. But that's what's different about children. Each child is different.
Right.
So, I mean, it just depends on who they are targeting. But he wasn't counting on you to do that.
Yeah, and I thought his reaction was interesting.
Yes.
But, knowing what I know now, I imagine that just messed up whatever little fantasy he had. I wasn't going along with whatever he had planned. And I think a lot of it, so many times, too, it's a crime of opportunity, especially with like abductions or kidnappings. It's not necessarily, maybe they are out trolling for somebody to abduct in some cases, but a lot of times it's just if there's an opportunity. And there I was walking along, and he saw me walking along, and then he saw me stop. And I just still can't believe I did that. But, I didn't have any idea of the real danger.
Right. Your child. It's never the child's fault, ever.
Yeah, no, it never is. And that's what I hope that all these parents, and all these victims who have experienced this understand it is not their fault, that they were manipulated and used. And then it'll be interesting to see what happens with, this Campos case. Yep. What other people come forward, how many other victims they identify, if they are able to identify some of these other boys that are in here, because that he took that to a whole level. That sounds like something that's been going on for years.
Oh, yeah. He has taken this out of this world. This is a developing story. It's just happened here recently. We're here in the middle of summertime, and there will be more about this, and this will blow the lid off of a lot of things.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Pam, any other takeaways in this last segment of Lambs to the Slaughter?
I think just watch your children, and to teach our children, come to me. Come to me as your parent or your aunt or your grandparent. I will always listen to you.
Yes, and be aware of the signs that their personality does change, because I think that was the point I started to make earlier about the child who had reported being, the young man who had reported being molested by the priest as a child. He as he got older, he didn't share the information, and he got into fights, and he, probably got into drugs and alcohol a little bit. He was angry a lot. And now years later, his parents and his family and friends understand better where that was coming from. He's been into therapy. He now feels like he wants to go to law school and become a prosecutor so that he can go after predators like this. He recognizes that he was groomed. He recognizes that this man took advantage of his insecurities, and his parents have given him the love and the space, and actually coming forward has created deeper bonds with one of his parents who perhaps didn't fully understand how it contributed to his behavior. So keep an eye on your kids and notice when their behavior changes, if there's something different about them. And I can't help but think of the Ryan Walsh case and how the parent found the illicit communication on the daughter's phone between her and him, the youth pastor. And, there must have been something going on for them to come across that, whether it was accidental or maybe they went looking for it on purpose because they saw that something was amiss.
Right.
Don't be afraid to snoop. It's important.
If something seems wrong, it might be. Just go ahead and investigate it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, anything else?
I think that's it for right now.
Yep, absolutely. There's always more cases to talk about. So thank you so much for joining us, Pam.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching. And if you want to catch this episode or any others, be sure to tune in to Gulf Coast Confidential on my YouTube channel. And you can also listen anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. There'll be much more to come. Thanks for joining us.